Okay, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in Canada. It'll be a different time of the day. Welcome to this roundtable. We've invited four people, advocates and supporters of inclusive education from four different provinces in Canada to join us today. And we're going to have a chat about inclusive education, how it's going well, what some of the challenges are from the perspective of these four guests we have, panelists today from different parts of Canada. And I'm Gordon Porter. I'm the Director of Inclusive Education Canada. And I guess I would just say in beginning that inclusive education is talked about quite a bit in Canada in education circles. It talks about by parents, by teachers, by the public, newspapers and CBC radio shows. And there is a link. Often it's connected with resources and articulation of the fact that supporting inclusion is a challenge. It's difficult, and local school districts and ministries of education say they're committed to inclusion, or many of them do, some don't. But resources is an issue, as well as inclusion itself. Now, I've been around this movement for a while, and I have to tell you that from a policy perspective, things are much better than they were 30, 40 years ago. Most schools and school districts and ministries of education give at least grudging support to inclusion. That wasn't always the case. But in Canada, we still have a lack of inclusive education in many communities. And it's a struggle, it's difficult, and in many cases, parents face some of their more significant challenges when it comes to having their child with a special need or disability going to school. I'd like to just share with you a perspective on that. I'm going to share my screen for a moment. And back in the 1980s, what we now call Inclusion Canada changed its name to the Canadian Association for Community Living. That was quite a dramatic step at that time. And because there was a new name, the people involved in the provinces and in the national level thought that with a new name, we needed a new mandate. We needed to focus on the issues that were most important to families across the country. So Community Living 2000 was the policy agenda set in 1987. And there were six key goals set. And you'll note that at the top, the first two had to do with children. The first one, that children would have a meaningful family life. And at that time, there were still many public institutions for children with disabilities, and many children were not living with their natural families, particularly those that had very challenging needs, because the supports weren't there, the school placements weren't there, and it was a really big issue. The second objective, which also dealt with children, is that kids would be able to go to the regular class in neighborhood schools and get a real education with their peers. And that was expressed quite directly in this objective that this is 1987 when this was set. And people thought 5 years was a time sufficient to accomplish this goal. So they said by 1992, all children will go to school together with other children in the neighborhood and get an age appropriate program to match their needs in regular school classes. Now, that's the way this was articulated in 1987. We might state it differently today, but it was clearly saying we need to do things differently and we need to work to have this happen over a 5 year period, which seemed eminently possible. Now, we know that we have not met that goal. We do not have that assurance in public education across Canada, and it's nearly 40 years later. So that's I think, the context for our discussion tonight. And I'm going to ask a few questions to our panelists and see what they think about where we are at the end of this school year, 2025, and going forward. So I'm first going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves very briefly And we'll start on the East Coast. Vivian.
Hey everyone, Vivian Tharmratnam. I'm the executive director here with Inclusion at Nova Scotia.
Okay. And Ontario, Paula.
Good evening for those of us in Ontario. I am Paula Budis. I'm the president of Inclusion Action in Ontario. We are a small but mighty, mostly volunteer organization of parents and family members who advocate for others in the community.
Okay. And out to Winnipeg, Manitoba, Janet.
Hi, I'm Janet Forbes. I'm the executive director at Inclusion Winnipeg. I was just thinking about Gordon. Those years ago, I was working in preschool, thinking those kids were going to get into regular school. So, yeah.
And skipping over the border into Saskatchewan with Brittany.
Hi, good afternoon for those of you this far west. I'm Brittany Acton. I'm Director of Initiatives with Inclusion Saskatchewan.
Okay. So we have 4 different people who have different roles and different perspectives. We've got a provincial executive director, a local executive director of what used to be Community Living, now Inclusion Canada. We have Brittany, who's part of the provincial association in Saskatchewan. I guess that's 2. And then we have another kind of parent-oriented action committee or action group in Ontario that Paula represents, Inclusion Action Ontario. So we have people with different roles and different experiences, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. The first thing I want to pose to you is, I wonder if you would reflect on why inclusive education remains a priority for you and your organization now 40 years after we first said it's important. How about starting with you, Janet?
The basis of it is it's a human rights, and Canada has signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights of the People that ensure that all kids get an education. I also think that it is something that we talk about people being on the normal path to inclusion, and that is where it starts. That's the starting point. Get the kids into the regular classrooms early on, give them the supports that they need, and they will be able to move through. And as they exit school, will be ready to take on adulthood as an equal citizen. So it's just important that we start them off right, continue to support them throughout, and in the end, congratulate them for being so successful.
Okay, Vivian, what about you? What's Inclusion Nova Scotia thinking about?
I'll echo exactly what Janet says. To us, like with respect to education, like it's foundational, right? So it's where kids are learning, and not just the students with disabilities, but also their peers, that they're kind of learning that this is how we build an inclusive society in the future and an inclusive community. I know within the Nova Scotian context, I'll just share this really quickly, is we had a recent story on CBC around a story around exclusion of a young learner from the school. And if you look at some of the Facebook comments that came up after it, it just tells you how important education and prioritizing inclusive education is. And it's this like notion of all these people posting unpopular opinion or controversial thought and disguising the discrimination and the belief that students with disabilities don't deserve to be in the classroom, or it creates a unsafe classroom, or it creates an environment that doesn't support learners, which we know is false. And so I think that's why more than ever right now, it's really important for us as an organization, but as a country, to prioritize inclusive education.
Okay, Brittany, what about in Saskatchewan?
Yeah, good question. I could also echo everything everyone else has said. Inclusion Saskatchewan was founded on the need for education. It was a lot of parents who came together and decided they wanted their kids to go to school. And it's sad to say that we're still doing the same advocacy now. I think I dream of working myself out of a job, and hopefully it comes in my lifetime. As an organization, though, we provide individual advocacy across the province in all systems, but we've seen pretty big increases in the requests for support in education, and they've been getting more complex and more challenging to resolve in recent years. I know we're going to talk more about which direction things are going in our provinces, but just seeing new issues coming up I think pushes us to continue working on the things that we need. As an organization, we've been getting a lot louder about our expectations for the education system and for schools. Like Vivian said, every time we're in the media, we end up on the receiving end of a lot of ableist opinions and just a non-understanding of what inclusive education is and why we're pushing for it. We see general public doesn't really know what inclusive education is, or its benefits, or their obligation to be providing it. So we take that upon ourselves as an organization, and that's why we will keep working at it.
Paula, how about you?
I really don't have anything to add. I will just say what our tagline is: inclusive education is the foundation of an inclusive life. And that is exactly the philosophy that we operate under. We focus on human rights and good pedagogy, and that's it. Regular classroom, neighborhood school. And it really is the foundation of an inclusive life. It is exactly the cosmos of the world in which our kids are hoping to live. And if for the first 18, 21 years of their lives, they're in specialized classrooms away from everyone else, suddenly, I don't know how anybody expects our kids to succeed in the rest of the world. They don't know how to interact with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world doesn't know how to interact with them, depending on the nature of the disability. So yeah, that's it.
Okay. And I think a couple of our panelists are parents. Can you share what the parent perspective is in addition to your thoughts as a member of an organization?
So would you like me? I'm not sure who else is a parent besides me. Sorry. I think Brittany is. I'll let Brittany go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I have two kids, both with disabilities and with quite different support needs in the classroom. And I feel really honored to be able to be doing this work, but also selfish about it at the same time, because ultimately I'm hopefully looking out for their needs and the needs for kids like my own. Yeah.
I guess I could add that for me, so I'm by training a lawyer. And early on, I spent a lot of time trying to understand the legal framework, and I was simply baffled by the Education Act and this definition of people by categories of disability. And I thought, how do I figure out? All I wanted to know was how my kid was going to be supported in the classroom. And I was confronted with definitions and meetings about deciding what kid definition my kid met. And then I read legislation on appeals, and I'm like, what? The whole thing struck me as just so incredibly process-based and having absolutely nothing to do with a functional classroom. And so that's what got me interested. And it's been an interesting experience because we were in, for a number of years, Canada's largest board, so the Toronto District School Board, which is also probably the most segregated board in the country. And I had to fight pretty hard. In the end, I actually managed to get something half decent for the years that we were there. But ironically enough, it became a little harder in a different board when we left. And then we chose an inclusive board for high school for a couple of years, and then had to come back to Toronto, where I feel like we're just back at square one. So
Just following up and moving to a broader question, Paula, maybe we'll start with you. What you just said kind of links to a couple of things. One is the overwhelming bureaucracy of the traditional special education system and the challenges that presents to parents. And you're a lawyer. Not every parent's a lawyer. So I'm interested in your perspective on that. And what are the challenges that you think are most prevalent today to parents? And the parents that are part of your organization, like it's very much a parent-driven thing. It's not a large, wealthy, or connected to government grants, or it's a grassroots parent organization. So can you just talk a little bit about what your parent members experience and reflect a little bit about the complex obstacles that they face?
yeah,
And
sure. Yeah, I can do that. We get a lot of questions where I can tell the families just have no idea what the legal framework is that they work in. And so they are consistently told by many boards, not all, but by many boards, that specialized is better. Your kid will get more support in a special education classroom. They have theoretically better trained people. People focus a lot on the ratio of teacher to student as if that was going to solve the problems. And they, of course, much more quietly, you just hear teachers murmuring a lot about the violence in the classroom. And somehow that's always the fault of students with disabilities. And so parents are facing huge barriers the minute they step into any school almost in Ontario, because with the exception of a couple of boards, which have taken out any possibility of specialized classrooms for the most part, and they operate on a fully inclusive model. Most boards don't do that. And so I've had friends who they told me their experience going to their neighborhood school was, no, you can't come here. Even though it's their legal right, even though there's a whole process, and that process by law requires you to consider a regular classroom placement first. And the other thing I've more recently heard was from a woman who's trying to get her daughter into a high school placement in a regular classroom, being told that the principal had the right to decide her daughter could not do that. And I had to explain to her that was absolutely not the law. There was a committee, there was a process, there's appeal rights, and her daughter's right was to be in the regular classroom. And so it's a very common refrain. So boards actually don't follow the law. They choose to perpetuate the myth that specialized classrooms are better, because I don't really know why. I don't even hear many of the teachers in these specialized classrooms saying that anymore. They feel like everything isn't working anymore in Ontario. And so at least people are no longer saying to parents endlessly, the same way they were before, that everything will be rainbows and sunshine in a special education classroom. It's still a really hard go. And so organizations like ours are critical to be able to explain to people what the actual law and rights are. And I do understand that many people do access our resources.
Okay. Janet, any follow-up on that from
Yeah.
you work with families right in your city directly?
I think that just Paula, you made some really good points, and I think that sometimes they wait for parents to get worn down almost before responding, and that's the humiliating part of it, is to have to beg for something that someone's entitled to. So I'm happy with some of the things that have happened in Manitoba in terms of some of the policy reviews, but it's the actual cases on the ground. So yes, I'm in Winnipeg. I'm with a provincial branch, and we are an advocacy organization. We're not a service provider. So we have the privilege of working with families who sometimes have very complex needs for the child to be supported with some behaviors, and we're still concerned about the number of kids that are not getting a full day of school, even though that's what they are entitled to. And we get closer and closer to the end of this school year, and there's a family we know that the little guy's been out of school for months and months, has barely been in school this year. So I think that the parents, organizations like ours, we do need to exist, because sometimes we're the ones that can make sure that when we're talking with the families that we're saying, you're right, like this is your child's right to be in school. And here's what's behind that. We've got the time that we can go and look up all the policies and pieces of legislation that exist, which is just often too much for a family just getting through a day. They don't have the time to go searching for all of those kind of things. And so I think that I wish that we were farther ahead when we think about the decades that we have been working on this. And yes, it's a case of there's always resources. That's always going to be the issues. But why do one population of students need to bear the responsibility of the budget and the resources that are available? So yeah.
Vivian and Brittany, Inclusion Canada and Inclusive Education Canada have been involved with both of your provincial associations recently in individual cases in each province where children were basically not allowed to go to school for very long periods of time. And there were significant struggles by the parents to try to address that. Parents who had some support and who, I think to some degree, compared to parents that I know and have worked with in the past, knew about the bureaucracy or how to deal with authority more so than maybe many other parents. And they still, and using Janet's word, were humiliated by the refusal of the system to work with them respectfully and to try to resolve issues that were standing in the way of their child going to school. Could each of you reflect a little bit, not specifically about the cases with names or anything like that, but the general experience of your association in supporting parents who are facing that kind of challenge? And do you want to start, Vivian?
Yeah, but both Manitoba and Ontario, the system is very similar out here. It is, and the more and more, I think, just even in the more recent years, it's becoming more rigid. And even though there's a focus maybe on definitions and defining disability and defining ableism and that EDI language training, the implementation of the inclusive education policy and the work of actually creating relationships and a sense of belonging for students doesn't really exist. And which is why parents have to, like you said, fight for any resources. And then when they do fight, it's almost when there is even small wins, it's presented as like a gift or a favor and not necessarily as a right that every other child has and they also deserve. So I think that's the biggest thing that needs to shift overall. But yeah, I'll just echo like the even our biggest concern is we're fortunate that some of the parents that are connecting with us have an understanding or have the resources to be able to look into the policies, look into the levels of bureaucracy and how to escalate complaints and issues and concerns and work. But there's a ton of other people that don't. And so it's how do we support those learners as well? That's what we're trying to get out right now. So yeah.
Brittany?
Think everyone else has spoken to the processes so much better than I could. But I think the parents' experience overall, like, often gets lost in this, and they are the advocate and they're the one in the school meetings and things like that. But they're also the parent who has to go home and take care of this kid who they has just been completely villainized to them and had teachers telling them how terrible these behaviors are and how unacceptable it is to have echolalia of a curse word and things that are absolutely tied to their disability, but then also have to manage all the other parts of life. So we have one family that we have supported in the past here who their child had some behaviors directly tied to their disability and was excluded from school. I think he was attending maybe an hour a day when they came to us. And because of that, mom lost her job because she couldn't be going to work and have him at home. And they actually ended up losing their housing because of it as well. And we are in a housing crisis right now. So that's not something we can fix. So suddenly this one issue of ableist mindsets in the classroom and just a complete unwillingness to be flexible and compassionate and find the tools they need leads to just these really extensive long-term traumas for this family. And I think that piece of the experience is often lost in discussions with schools.
Could I
Yeah.
just add to that too? Yeah, because we know families too that have not been able, have had to leave jobs. So when they talk about resources, you need to think about the resources of a family as well too. So if the system doesn't have the resources and a parent has to leave the workforce, they don't have the resources they need either.
No, Janice stole my comments. But no, is one of the things that's often lost is that economic output, right? And specifically the impact that it has on like mothers who have to, whether it's if a student is on partial days or they're being removed on a daily basis, it's those families that are dealing with the fallout of that, and then that leads to job insecurity and potential loss and the fallout from that. So yeah, it's interesting because we never think like people talk about resourcing and what all that stuff, but there's also this support mechanism that now needs to occur to balance that out too.
So Vivian just talked about resources, and that's come up a few times. Other than telling the Ministry of Education they should double the education budget or the support budget, and we know that's not going to happen, but what would you ask that a Minister of Education do? One thing that would make a difference and overcome an obstacle that you think is significant in your province. Is there anything in particular that's doable? It's something that's not unrealistic to the general public that you think would make a difference? And if so, what would that be? Robin? What would be Robin? I'm sorry.
Did you mean Paula or no?
Brittany. I called you.
Brittany.
I was thinking Robin for some reason. Brittany, what would it be in Saskatchewan? What would you ask, like a doable thing that would make a difference?
This is one that I have been asking over the last few months, and I actually noticed a question from Kathy in the chat here asking, because it's similar in Alberta. And that would just be to align your definition of inclusive education with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The way our Ministry of Education has defined inclusive education leaves plenty of space for segregation. And we can't tell teachers what you're doing isn't inclusive education if their employer is telling them that it is. And it's really clearly defined and it's accepted worldwide, and we just need to align better with that.
Okay. So it would be clarity of definition and maybe clarity of policy. How many school divisions do you have in Saskatchewan?
27 plus registered independent schools, and all of them have a lot of freedom to do whatever they want.
So doing something in one community doesn't necessarily transfer to another.
Yeah, and that's why I think that overarching Ministry of Education definition that all the policies go back to, that really needs to be where it starts, is like, just get the foundation laid and let's work off from there.
Okay, Paula, what would you ask that the ministry do, that something doable that would make a difference?
Close specialized classrooms. I have repeatedly said I don't know how you can offer everything and actually succeed at inclusion.
Right.
Because if you are trying to run a congregated school like the Toronto District School Board does, and those cost on average $40,000 a pupil, and complain the regular classroom doesn't have the resources, I can't grasp this. There is so much money in the Toronto District School Board. There is so much money in school boards. How are they spending that money? I don't think there isn't enough money. I think there's enough money. I think there's a lack of will. I think there is a failure to put in the right kinds of accommodations. I think that there is a desire to run a school like a congregated school with highly specialized equipment and people who, well, not always that specialized people, and they live in a bubble, and actually people want it. It is a brutally difficult conversation to have, because I have experienced, when I was a member of the Special Education Advisory Committee for 5 years at TDSB, we had a lot of momentum for inclusive advocacy in that 5 years. And we got as far as getting a recommendation passed to close, for crying out loud, the congregated schools. At least do that. And it was just a recommendation on our part, but this brought out parents storming and showing up to our meetings. And one family actually brought their child, and put that child to us and said, honestly, it was really hard to watch and listen to this family talk about their kid like the burden that they were, and how the only right place for them was in this school. It is extremely difficult to have these conversations when ableism is still so fully ingrained in everybody's heads. And remember that parents rarely are disabled themselves, right? They don't live the life of a disabled person and then have children with disability. Of course, sometimes it happens, but a lot of these folks, it's just random genetic errors, very significant complex needs. And all they see is, my kid can't live a regular life. This is the better place for them, and they believe it. So I think they should just close segregated schools, and then they will free up a lot of money and a lot of resources and place them in the neighborhood schools. Get rid of the transportation busing for the local kids from Toronto, like, so they can travel an hour away from their homeward school. There's so many ways to save money, but you have to change the system. And we're not going to get there until we deal with ableism.
One of the things that I emphasize these days when I talk to people about inclusive education is that, and it's following up on what you just said now, is that every time you take a child out of a regular class with a quote regular teacher and send them somewhere different, you're not only sending the child, you're sending money, you're sending resources, you're taking the capacity to support the regular class and the student included away. And unless you have enormous amounts of money so that you can properly support inclusion and also fund a special education system, it won't work. And it won't work. And no province has that kind of money, and no one's willing to spend it. Over to you, Vivian. What's your thought on this? What's the one thing that you would ask of
I
your
think Paul's answer was really good, but I'll also add on. I think where we've seen some of the successes or the wins has been where when like the principals and the administrators within a school have really taken on inclusion and had the training and had the ingrainment in there to be able to move the school forward a little bit. And so I guess my one ask would be one realistic ask would be that there's a more of a focus on that training and that development piece at the administrative level, and then ensuring that when we talk about things like we have an inclusive education policy that half the school's principals that we talk to don't even know exists or have no idea what it is. And so ensuring that is there and that beyond just the understanding of the policy, but the training and the confidence to be able to enact it at that level. So I think that'll help in moving stuff forward
Okay,
realistically.
Janet.
I'm not sure exactly how this would be framed, but I would ask a minister of education to ban exclusion from school. And knowing that there probably are situations with other students, not just kids who have an intellectual disability, where it's looked at as a last resort. It's a safety issue for other students, it's a safety issue for the person themselves. And that there be a time limit. If someone is going to be suspended, it's for a certain amount of time, which immediately should start the process for getting them back. And it may not be successful in all cases, but I think it's that intent and that willingness to say, we're not sending kids we're not kicking them out of school. And if you've I don't know how many cases that would be, but I know that we know of enough that kids are out of the school too long. And even with a dozen people coming together at meetings, and that costs a lot of money, they're still not back in school. So to really get to the bottom of why kids, they feel that having them sent home is going to make it better, when the only place where they're really going to understand and learn how they need to be at school and how they need to be when they're in the classroom is going to be there. They get sent home from school. They're not learning
Do any
that.
of you feel from your experience that the people in the school, specifically principals, maybe their support staff, that they have the capacity to solve problems that are major problems, critical and difficult? Or does the school as an organization typically not have the capacity or the resources or the flexibility in order to solve a problem? It gets kicked up to a higher level and it's not as urgent for people in the further up the bureaucracy, and that this lack of ability to have resources at the frontline level could contribute to the challenge.
Yeah,
Anyone
and I don't
say that?
I can't say I don't know that if what that chain might be in that communication. I know that some places do it better than others. They've just made that decision. They're not going to suspend a kid. This is how we're going to manage. So, and I know every division does operate differently, but we have in Winnipeg, the largest division, certainly in Winnipeg, and the largest division in the province, they've said they're not going to send kids home early. There's not going to be partial days. So it's work, but it's that commitment that has to come first. In this province, kids that are supposed to be in school are going to be in school, and it will, if there's a reason for them to be out of school, it's going to have to go through this and this filter and provide the support that a family needs when that happens, but that it should not go on for weeks and months.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, before we turn to some questions and issues from people who are tuned in, what do you think we need to do to advance? Like that objective set almost 40 years ago, we still haven't achieved. I think that's clear. But what do you think it would take? And it's a broader application of the question that we just talked about. But what are we going to have to do? How do we move forward? Is it that we need to work stronger with families, support families? Do we need better laws and policies? Do we need a cadre of lawyers who can challenge school districts that don't comply? Somebody inferred earlier that the system can play it out if a parent challenges a decision, it can be 6 months or a year before the situation can even get to the point of being resolved. Like maybe most parents don't have the capacity to challenge a school district, which can draw on funds from the province to pay for lawyers to represent their point of view. So whether it's at the policy, ministerial level, the school district level, people in the school, teachers, principals, or working with parents and solidifying the family support system that we have across our provinces. What do you think? And it could be something different altogether if you have an idea that's different, but what do we need to do so that we don't wait another 40 years and we're in the same situation we are today? Who wants to start?
I could just start. I'm a just 1995 or 6, where we had a very significant case that went to the Supreme Court of
Can you get
Canada.
close to your mic, Paula?
Oh, sorry. Is this better?
That's better.
I didn't really change anything. We had a significant case in the mid-90s dealing with inclusive education. And though the family lost, at that point, the legislation was changed to require that a regular classroom be considered first. And that was the last time we had any major changes at all in education law in Ontario. And it seems quite stuck there. And as a matter of practice, that is often ignored anyway. So I think we really have to go back to the definition, dealing with ableism, focus on the human rights aspects of it, because that's impossible to argue with. Once you have the framework and people accept that that is the legal framework, they just have to stop making excuses. And right now we have a very dual, legally it's in Ontario, and I imagine in other places, it is a split personality, if you will. You have this whole definitions, exceptionalities, special classrooms, and then you have the code, which requires you to accommodate people as much as possible within the regular community. And they just don't really seem to meet very well. So I really think at the core of this is still a lot of ableism. And one of the comments was that, and how do I think we should address it? People with disabilities need to be in our schools to address it, to live with. We don't say the Black students, they belong somewhere else, and this religion belongs somewhere else. People can choose to be somewhere else. We can't stop that. We don't try to stop that. Affinity groups, all that. But we learn to interact with different cultures and different genders and gender identities by being with those people, by being together. And it is the same thing with disability. It's never going to work as long as we insist that students belong somewhere else down the hall. And so I really think that ableism is a critical factor that still doesn't get enough attention. And in Ontario, we define students with disability, developmental disabilities, as a limited potential for academic learning, independent social adjustment, and economic self-support. We define them that way. So the minute you do that, what does anybody expect of that child? We have to move to the presumption of competency and the human rights. Who cares? I don't even want to know what someone's IQ is. Just sit down with me and work out an accommodation plan and work on the goals that work for that student. But we're not there because our entire system is designed for people who are typical learners. So we struggle with teachers who are like, but no credits. How can I have them in my classroom? But I still have to evaluate them and I don't know how. So I don't actually feel a lot for the teachers. I definitely do. And I am pleased to say, I will say this because we didn't get to talk a little bit about the positives. Some of the positives we've noticed, at least for us now that we're much more visible, is everybody's reaching out to us. So we have the teachers union, the elementary school panel reaching out to us. They want to work with us on a series of inclusive documents for teachers in the classroom, knowing it's there, and they want to support their teachers. Media reaches out to us. We have a lot more visibility than we used to. So on the positive side, even though I know we still have so far to go, we are talking and collaborating with people more than, at least in my personal experience, than before.
Okay, Brittany.
Yeah, I think a lot like Paula, there's two different pathways I see in the Saskatchewan system. For a long time, we were moving closer and closer to inclusion, both in policy and in practice. The last couple of years, we're just seeing a lot more backslide. So I think with 27 different school divisions and each of them having a lot of freedom, the one great thing could be some of those leaders in inclusive ed really championing inclusion. We've seen one school division that took it upon themselves to completely desegregate, and things are never perfect in a division. They're only a few years into it, but still they were able to make that decision for themselves with the same funding that every other division gets. And they moved the needle forward for the communities they have there. So I think those champions for inclusion are really a big potential for making a difference. And then the second pathway for me, and one that I see as most ideal, would be that precedent-setting legal challenge to our provincial system. We have a system set up where there is a lot of freedom and things can be going well, and then there can be new leadership and things can change again. And I think without legal protections in place that are like really clear to hold people accountable, I really worry that we would just be back here meeting again 20 years later, even if we start to do great and desegregate without those legal protections in place. I worry that it would just be the same cycle over and over again.
Janet.
Yeah, I wanted to say too is that I want to add to this in that there are some really good things I believe that are happening in our province from that policy place. There is a vision and there is a framework for inclusion. So I think that there are, at the same time that there are some positive things at that level, there's been some other things that give me hope for a kid having a good experience when they are at school. And we know that in a lot of the classrooms, there's the educational assistants who are in the classroom supporting the kids and the teacher. And there's now training for them. And before it was depending on what the needs were, someone who could easily be an EA. And now there's more professionalism of that group of people. And I think they're really important to the classroom. And so I think that's a positive step. We also, now that here, and I think in other provinces as well too, early learning comes under the Ministry of Education as well too. So that early start for kids that are going into the daycare centers and the early learning centers, I think that's also a positive thing. And the recent announcement about the increases to wages across Canada or for the EC workers and stuff. Hopefully that is going to bring people in who look at this as being a career because they are going to be in the classroom. Everything is just it seems to be taking so long. So there's some good things and we don't want the good things to be forgotten. And I know that there are people that are working hard at preparing teachers to go into the classrooms. And so I think we just need to always keep that balance of we don't want to lose what's working well, but we think other things need to improve.
Vivian, final word to you.
Oh boy. Yeah, everything everyone else has said. And I'll say, as Janet mentioned, like that professionalization of ECEs, I know that's had an impact early childhood educators in Nova Scotia. And I think similar notions of improving the career of the support staff would be beneficial here. But I do think, like we said, where we've seen the successes is when there's been that culture change or that there is an embedded culture of inclusion within the schools because of the administrators and the people and the teachers within it. So providing that training, because oftentimes resources can also just mean the training and the ways on how to actually facilitate like relationships and connections among students to facilitate authentic inclusion. So I think that's key. And then on the other end, from a policy perspective, we're fortunate we have an inclusive education policy that some of the brightest minds worked on. That's a plug to Gordon because Gordon supported that. But what we're seeing is the lack of awareness of it and the implementation of it. So holding that to account I think is what we need to do as a province, and then pushing for it nationwide as well. So having that legislation is great, but it's nothing if it's not being implemented.
Yeah, I'll just say in winding up this conversation before we go to people who've joined us, is that I have been part of crafting a few policies in different parts of Canada. But let me tell you that once you put a policy in place, you write it and it gets issued, control leaves. It goes to the users. And it's the same thing in law. I'm sure that Paula would know about that, that policy is one thing, but once it's out there, like if your province has 500 schools, every school principal is going to look at it or not look at it at all and decide what it means. They're going to interpret it for themselves. And the only way that you get the policy objectives is that there's a lot of work to make sure there's a common understanding of what the policy is intended to accomplish. And when policies are simply issued and there isn't the kind of work with the people who have to understand it and implement it, then policy is not going to make a difference. And that's,
I just
think we miss
wanted
that.
to add a comment on this, like in a somewhat different context, but relating to special education. I was dealing with an administrator who actually said to me, "Is it more important that you follow the law? Is that your issue?" And actually, I hit this a lot. If they don't believe in the law, they feel free to ignore it. And because there's no consequence to that, they just do. And I don't just see that in education contexts. I was in a seminar today where we were having a session on labor and employment law. And the first thing this lawyer said was, stay in compliance with the law. Like as if it had to be said. It is in a country like Canada, where you think we are all more or less law-abiding citizens, you can see how easily that slips just by watching what's happened in the United States, right? But we're no less victim to that. It's very easy for people to just decide they're not going to follow the law. And when there's no consequences, that's what happens. So
Yeah, there has to be an accountability system built in. And what would happen if a school or school division's financial records or didn't follow provincial policy? What would happen? Somebody'd intervene. We have auditors to look at that. But we don't have any auditors to look at the educational outcomes or the practices that actually directly affect the children. And I know that there's a lot of hard work in education systems to develop accountability, but I guess society hasn't had the expectation that's brought it about yet. And maybe we can be part of the reason why that happens. I'd thank you all. It's been interesting to hear your perspectives from different parts of Canada. And what I'd like to do now is have Charlotte join us, Charlotte Pike, who's support to our education endeavors with Inclusion Canada and Inclusive Education Canada. And Charlotte's been monitoring any questions or comments that people have posted, and she's going to identify some of the ones that maybe our panelists can reflect on. Over to you, Charlotte.
Alrighty, we've received a lot of questions here, and I see that a couple have been answered. So thank you to the panelists for also looking at that and answering them in your responses as well. The first question is, how can education be inclusive in remote communities when we struggle with a lack of resources and teachers? This is particularly true in Northern Canada.
Anybody?
Yeah, I'd love to answer that one. We have a lot of remote communities in Saskatchewan here. Inclusion Saskatchewan has offices up in Creighton, Flin Flon area, as well as La Ronge. And while those are rural rather than remote, we have a lot of the same issues. What I actually find is that inclusive education is often easier in those places because there aren't segregated classes. It's just the automatic assumption that every kid goes into a regular class because that's the only thing there is in that school. That's not the case everywhere, and certainly we've had some challenges with some schools moving more to exclusion instead, but it does seem like the status quo is just to go into a regular classroom. As far as EAs and additional supports in the school that are needed, I wish I had an answer for that. It's one that we're constantly trying to problem solve, and we found a lot of great team members who can work remotely through Zoom and things like that, and offer some kind of co-teaching, some strategies from afar. But if an extra person is needed in the school, then that does become a really big challenge. We've seen some school divisions who offer the job to parents or to older siblings or family members, and that's worked for some people, but certainly it's not going to work for everyone.
I've done some work in Northern Canada, not directly myself, but working with people who work there. And one of the things that I found is that children themselves can be a tremendous resource. And if the right kind of culture is built in the community and the school, it doesn't take outside paid adults to make the difference. That if the teacher creates a climate where there's a lot of peer support, peer interaction, collaborative kind of work among children, they can be the strongest supports for inclusion that you could ever find. Anyway, anyone else, or Charlotte, something else?
Okay. I'm particularly interested in thoughts about including students with intense support needs, including those who need augmented and alternative communication. I often worry that when we talk about inclusion, we don't really mean to include everybody. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that and experiences with including some of the most vulnerable of our students.
I think I can say that our panelists are all committed to the inclusion of every child. And we actually give them a blood test before they come on a panel to make sure that's true. But I'll ask whoever wants to respond to that.
If I could just quickly start, there is no doubt in my mind that the most complex kids can be included in every classroom. I have seen it done. And again, it comes down to the willingness. You can get a little bit of nursing support if that's required. If the school is willing to facilitate the rules to let that happen. Again, so much is left to the school, and it's really hard because there's so little oversight, but absolutely can happen. Nonverbal, physical disabilities. But I know of one school board that has very few special education classrooms, and they just made it their mission to renovate every single building so that it was accessible to all their students for physical needs. And so every single school it's an accessible school. I would love to see even a 10th of TDSB schools be accessible, right? But that's not the goal. So when it isn't your goal, it isn't going to happen. So all I can say is I am absolutely sure it can happen when that is the goal.
Anybody else?
I feel bad for answering 2 questions in a row, but I'm going to do it anyways because I am so passionate on this. When I say include every student, every single student, we've supported kids who are living in long-term care homes because their medical needs are so high, and they were very successfully included in an inclusive classroom once the school knew what they were doing. But what I always find interesting about this discussion is there's a lot of research, which I'm a bit of a nerd, so I'll always turn back to research, that people don't believe inclusive education until they see it. But once they see it, it just becomes a no-brainer. Once you see it successfully working, the limitation's gone. So it is one of those things that you really need to be exposed to successfully to be able to really wrap your head around it. But once you see that, it's so smooth and easy, and there's really no limitations on it.
Janet or Vivian?
Yeah, exactly what Brittany said. Oftentimes it may seem more complicated than it is, but once you see it, once you have the connections, once you're able to build your toolkit of resources and find those, we've seen it. And so yeah, it depends on, obviously it's it's case based. So we're not sure what the person's question was referring to, but like you said, every child needs to be included and every child can be included.
Janet?
I would just ask the other students, because oftentimes they'll have stories to say about a student that paints a whole different picture than what they might look like on paper. And it's no, when they do this, we do this, and then we go on with life. So use those resources that are classmates.
Charlotte?
Okay, how can we help school districts ensure that staff is better qualified to do the work that they are paid to do, knowing that we cannot make a staff member take professional development or classes?
I'll just respond to that in that I think that, as I said before, I see some examples here of the professional development training happening with the educational assistants as well as the additional training that some of the early childhood education workers get, the teachers who've graduated from and have their degree in education. I think that there is also efforts to provide additional professional development. If someone refuses to take it, I guess they're putting their job on the line, because they may not have a job forever if they don't stay up to date on what's the best way
Anybody
to
else?
support teachers.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I think I know with teachers, like a part of their job is that professional development piece, right? So ensuring that training and education around inclusive education is a priority. I think that's one key. But the other side too is I think you can also go from the other angle of starting to champion some of the people who are doing the good work, whether it's at the school level, whether it's at the board level, and hopefully that encourages them to see things differently. Going back to that, the last question, it's oftentimes like it is seeing is believing kind of thing, and taking that approach might be a way of doing it as well.
I think from like an advocacy perspective, what I quite often see is like it'll become adversarial and it's no, you need to take this training because your student needs it. And sometimes just flipping the script and saying, we're both here for the same reason. We both want this kid to succeed. You wouldn't have become a teacher if you weren't into it. So this is what we see him needing or what we see the student needing. So like, how can you work through that so that you are able to meet your students' needs? And
I
it quite often helps a lot.
I think that's an important point, that professional learning is not to help the student, it's to help the teacher be successful with the student. And if the teacher is facing these challenges, the professional learning that's provided certainly needs to address the things that they need every day to be more successful. And if they have the need, and if there's an offer of support to help them meet it more effectively, they're going to sleep better, they're going to do better, they're going to be less stressed in their life. And I think we have to try to make sure those two things link. But too many teachers see these kind of things as obligations. And yet I think we have to make sure there's a balance there between the need and the need to participate. Charlotte, next one. Next
Sorry,
question.
Gordon, can I just add something to that? I think like
Sure,
with
go ahead.
it's if there is a teacher that's saying they're adversarial against this kind of training, it's also looking at what's the root cause of that, and having hopefully
Yeah.
there's a workplace or a culture within their administration to have those discussions and to have the conversations around. If you got into teaching to teach students, why are you adversarial against teaching a student?
Exactly. Yeah. Charlotte.
Okay, what initiatives are out there to bring some hope? Where can a teacher focus attention to learn better ways to communicate with students in the classroom and gain resources on the front lines, since that's where most of the potential for helping an individual often rests? So many teachers just are working out of outdated and ableist information.
Anybody?
I think this is your answer here, isn't it, Gordon?
Yeah, I was like, is it Inclusive Education Canada?
Education.ca. That's
Yeah,
honestly where I refer people a lot.
I think if we use this framework of where we are today compared to the early days of inclusion, which we didn't even call it inclusion then, the word was integration, because kids were completely segregated. And the first step was to say, how can we get them integrated into the regular school? It's been a long time since the concept has been there. And I think that the difference between 25, 30 years ago is that the knowledge that's been generated through research and study and developing new ideas, and people in Canada that have developed concepts and approaches to supporting inclusion is remarkable. There's no shortage of information about how to make inclusion work in the classroom today if you want to seek it out. And we have marvelous people in Canada who can demonstrate very innovative approaches to that. Shelley Moore in British Columbia comes to mind, who just presents thought-provoking approaches, different ways to think about including kids and making classrooms work. And she's not the only one. Every university in Canada practically has a few people who specialize in inclusive education practice. So the knowledge about how to do inclusive education is available. but there's clearly a problem in making sure that the thousands and tens of thousands of teachers who get into our classrooms actually have that knowledge. But there's no shortage of knowledge. It has to be sought out. Anything else, Charlotte? Our time's nearly up. We have a few more minutes. One or two more questions, maybe, or issues for our panelists.
Sure. There's been a couple of comments around including students with behaviors. So oftentimes the solution is to put a child in a room by themselves because they're either harming themselves or they're harming other students. How do you support the school in supporting the student, or what do you do in the situation when their child cannot be included in the classroom due to these behavior issues?
So any of the situations that any of you have been involved with connect to that, and any thoughts about it? I think Brittany's sitting ahead, anticipating jumping into this one.
Always, apparently. I think once it's gotten to that point, the school's already failed. It has to start on day one and be proactive. I don't know that I've ever heard of a kid who shows up on the first day of school swinging fists, and it's when signs have been missed along the way and the environment isn't being managed and controlled that they end up there. And like that really is the end of the road. We don't want to get there, but that's usually when we get called. I'm not an occupational therapist, I'm not a psychologist, and they're much better people to give answers on the specific behavioral pieces. But really, as far as what the school needs to do is they need to be managing it before it becomes an issue. They need to be getting the strategies in place long before.
Paula, you
I
had
just-
experience with that with families?
I'm generally not the one involved in trying to problem solve that, but from my general reading and talking to people, all behavior is communication. And so what is that behavior communicating? Is the room too bright? Are the fans too loud? Is there a lot of noise in the room? Does the kid need to get up and move around for a while, go for a walk? I don't, or are they frustrated because they know they can understand and they're being treated like they're two? Like there's so many, or there's bullying going on in the school, which remarkably, the schools still frequently blame the bullied child for. A retaliation from a kid who's being picked on is the thing that becomes the behavior that gets focused on rather than the bullying that sometimes happens. I've definitely had a case where I was involved in that. And often a solution is to send them to a wholly different school. Like it is very, so all that to say, this one school that I'm thinking of where they renovated everything to make it physically accessible, that wasn't the only thing they did. They created a room in every school for a student to go and bounce on a ball or take a movement break if that's where the student wanted to go. So one of the people I work with at IAO is a volunteer. She's on one of our SEACs. She says, we need more rooms. We need more space for students who need that break. And these are voluntary choices. We're not talking about putting kids in seclusion rooms. We're talking about saying, hey, do you want 10 minutes to go and walk with me to the whatever? And then you're going to hear excuses around, we don't have enough adult bodies around to do that. But it's all about how you choose to spend the money and your resources in your system. If you design it to do that, you will be able to do it. Others have. Ultimately, I guess what I'm trying to say about all of this is it's all about the design and the choices that people make. And communication is behavior. So if the behavior is a problem, well, we've failed to address that.
Okay, Janet, go ahead.
Sure. I know that there has been a lot of work done here on looking at the safety in school and developing some safe at school policies. And I think that it's really important that there's a separation between a behavior that is a characteristic of someone and a behavior that's intended to hurt someone. And that, because I think that we all want our safe schools. We had just a horrific case here in Manitoba a couple of weeks ago when someone came into a school and attacked another student with a machete. There has to be broad safety protocols in place when it's urgent like that, but that should not be like if someone's behavior is part of their communication, that's a different sort of thing. It's not that you don't pay attention and you work with that, but it's different than lumping it all into whether somebody is safe to be in the school or risk the safety of other students.
Okay, I think we have time for one more comment or question or issue. Charlotte.
How can traditional knowledge help support inclusive education? Specifically, how can it help in Indigenous communities?
Okay, anybody up for that one?
I don't know how to respond, but I think hopefully we're getting past I hope we get past that place where we even have to ask that, but through learning and through our understanding and the knowledge that comes from the Indigenous community could benefit everybody. And so I think that it is all of us have an obligation to learn more, not just about the Indigenous culture, but we have a lot of newcomers and it's different. They're used to different things. We have people who've come from being in refugee camps and stuff. And so I think that there needs to be learning at a very deep level, ongoing. I don't have an answer. I just know that there's a lot I don't know.
I want to shout out to anybody in the Indigenous community who wants to talk to me. I tried a few years ago to find any sort of Indigenous, like formal Indigenous community group that was working on education, and I couldn't. But maybe they exist informally. I don't know. And it's hard for me to, and possibly any of us, I don't live in a community that's a significant, I actually do. Toronto has a significant Indigenous population, but it's not easily accessible to me. So I hope that if there are people out there who are part of the Indigenous community who can come and talk to us about how we can start to put that into our day-to-day work, I would absolutely welcome the opportunity.
Here in Saskatchewan, the last 2 years are award-winning Inclusive School of the Year. Both the last 2 years they won because they had land-based education programs that just really level the playing field for everyone. And they're just naturally so inclusive to have those more traditional approaches to the classroom. So it wasn't something I had considered a whole lot until I saw the first nomination like that. And since then, I try and read a lot into it. And I wish there were more formalized organizations, but I think there are a lot that are doing it very casually and maybe not calling it inclusive education because it's just the way it's done.
Okay, with that, we're going to have to close off. Our time's up. I want to thank everybody for joining us. You can see on the left of your screen that we're part of the Inclusion Canada network or federation across Canada with 13 provincial and territorial associations. And inclusive education is an initiative and program that's been in place for more than 20 years to support the development of inclusive education in Canada. We need your support and involvement, and we thank you for joining us when we can, when you're able to. We have two websites, inclusiveeducation.ca, and we have a new site that we just introduced this year called Source for Inclusive Education. And we invite you to access either of them. You'll find information, reports, various stories, and so on that may inform your interest in inclusive education. And I want to thank each of our panelists for participating. Thank you to each of you. And we'll be doing more roundtables and webinars in the coming school year, and hope that the folks who are with us tonight can join us, as well as many others. Thank you to Charlotte and Hassan from Inclusion Canada for supporting us this evening. And thank you all, and good night.